Thank you for joining our program today on early childhood mathematics. This program is sponsored by the Regional Educational Laboratory Midwest, typically abbreviated as REL Midwest. REL Midwest is part of a network of 10 regional laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. REL Midwest helps educators and policymakers expand their knowledge and understanding of research and its value to decision-making and education reform. We serve a 7-state region, including Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. REL Midwest is administered by American Institutes for Research, a not-for-profit research organization. This event is part of our Making Connections series, which bring together researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to engage in a collaborative discussion on education issues. We are pleased to present this broadcast in partnership with WFYI Indianapolis. We invite you to learn more about our work by visiting our website at www.relmidwest.org. I would like to introduce our moderator for the day, Dr. Eboni Howard. Eboni is a principal early childhood specialist at American Institutes for Research. She has approximately 20 years' experience conducting child and family research and policy studies and providing consultation on early childhood education. She has worked with the U.S. Department of Education's Early Reading First project and the Council of Chief State School Officers on kindergarten assessment efforts. Eboni served on a number of advisory boards, including the Illinois Early Learning Council and the National Research Council's Committee on Developmental Outcomes and Assessments for Young Children. Her recent work includes directing the evaluation of the Office of Head Start's Early Learning Mentor Coach Initiative and leading the REL Midwest Early Childhood Research Alliance. We are pleased to have Eboni as part of our program today.
Thank you, Dean. Research suggests that children in early childhood, as young as infancy, can start to develop a sense of numbering and counting. And we even know children less than 3 years old can start to solve complex problems using mathematical reasoning. How can we encourage early childhood mathematics in our early childhood programs in young childhood from birth to age 5? That will be our topic today, and we're lucky to have 3 wonderful guests join us. One is a researcher who has been renowned for his early childhood mathematics, Dr. Doug Clements. We also have 2 people from Indiana who have been very engaged in the Indiana state and local community in early childhood, Dr. Dana Jones and Dr. Ted Maple. Our panelists today will discuss children's capacity for developing mathematical thinking skills, the research that supports learning in mathematics in early childhood, the importance of early childhood math, not just in early childhood or for later education, but throughout a lifetime, as well as Indiana's response to early childhood math, including assessing and supporting both parents and teachers. Our first panelist is Dr. Doug Clements. He is a Kennedy Endowed Chair in Early Childhood Learning and professor at the University of Denver. Previously a kindergarten teacher and a preschool teacher, he has conducted research and published widely in the areas of learning and teaching in early mathematics and computer applications in mathematics education. He has published over 120 research articles, 18 books, 70 chapters, and 275 additional publications. Let's just say this guy really knows his stuff. His latest books details research-based learning trajectories in early mathematics educations. So welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Eboni.
Well, a common misconception among the general population is that young children really don't think math, or if they do think, it's just simple counting and memorization. Can your child count up to 10 or 20? Can you tell us a little bit more about what children really can do and know in early childhood math?
Absolutely. Before I talk about other topics in mathematics, let's just take counting for an example. Okay. A lot of people say rote counting, that's all you do in early childhood, is rote counting. But think about it, even verbal counting, even just knowing the number names, which is only a tiny piece of what counting's all about, involves more than just rote memorization. Mm-hmm. If I asked everybody here what number comes after 1,758, you'd all know that it's 1,759. Yeah. But you didn't memorize that. You know the structure of the number system. You know the system, the pattern that underlies it. So even verbal counting has more mathematics in it than we sometimes give it credit for. But then, this is just the beginning of counting. Kids have to learn to keep one-to-one correspondence between the number words that they say, the counting words that they enunciate, and the objects they're counting. That's a difficult task and an important mathematical idea. And then goes far beyond that. They have to understand cardinality, or how manyness, that counting is there for a purpose. It tells us how many objects there are in a set, or how many inches there are in the length of an object, or something like that. And then there's questions of problem solving. If you need to compare two groups, you can use counting to do it, but you have to know how to use counting to do it. Beginning arithmetic is based on counting notions for most children. So it spans from the very first years of life into the primary grades. The learning trajectory for counting is that broad and that wide, and the ideas behind it that deep. So when people say it's just counting in early childhood, I question whether they really know all that's involved in counting. But mathematics is much more than counting. It involves geometry, it involves spatial thinking, it involves patterns, sorting, classifying, ordering, all that. And at its heart, which you mentioned before, is mathematical reasoning. Thinking mathematically goes far beyond the memorization or something of a few facts. And what we want is for kids to see that the world is mathematical, and to see the world through those mathematical eyes enriches their lives in countless ways. So let's take one more example. Let's take shape, okay? We often don't do a very good job with teaching shape in early childhood.
I memorize a circle or a square, right?
And
a rectangle?
A rectangle and one more.
Oh,
a triangle. And then you're done.
And then I'm done. I've got those shapes and I'm good. Yes.
And it's often usually presented like this. You know, this is a square. It's held like this.
Yeah.
So the kids say it's a square. Very little else is done to elaborate it. We don't even talk about the fact that you do this and kids immediately say, now it's a diamond, without recognizing, of course, that the shape is still a square, regardless of its orientation. Research shows that not only that, but teachers often, when they do introduce any additional ideas, sometimes make mistakes because they haven't had very good mathematical experiences themselves, especially in geometry. For instance, one common thing for teachers to say is, now every time you cut a square, you get two rectangles. Now, you can get two rectangles, but of course, as we think about it just for a second, if you cut it a different way, you can get two triangles out of it. You can also cut it and get trapezoids and all kinds of things, but let's just take triangles as an instance, because if you do cut it into two triangles, another thing teachers will sometimes say is, and when you put two triangles together, you always get a square. You can get a square with these two triangles, but you know, if I think about it a little bit, and kids will think about it if you give them the challenge, you can also get a larger triangle. And more than that, if I'm really clever, I can get a parallelogram. So that there's so much richer geometric ideas that kids can handle. And when you give them those opportunities, they can surprise us with what they know. In a couple visuals I'd like to show you, illustrate some of the things that kids can do geometrically that kind of can surprise us sometimes. Let's take a look. In this visual, what we see is Corey is putting four triangles together, these wooden triangles, to fill this puzzle, to make squares. Up at the upper right, I've pictured for you how those four triangles together make a square, and then he plops that into a puzzle. He puts four more triangles together in a square, plops that into a puzzle. Now, the other boy sees that square structure, but he makes the wrong square. He puts only two triangles together. It doesn't fit in the puzzle. So the boys have this elaborate conversation about what you have to do to make it fit in the puzzle and finally finish the whole puzzle, which is great. When a teacher comes over, who's snapping these pictures actually, and asks, how many triangles did you use? Corey counts carefully, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 24. Good, the teacher says, but 24 what? She wants to be specific. 24 triangles, Corey answers. And then she asks, how many squares do you have? And this is where we find it particularly interesting, because what Corey does is curl up 4 fingers, puts the 4 fingers on each of the 4 triangles for each square and counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what Corey has done is not only good counting and shape naming and composition of shape into other shapes, he's also created a unit of units with his friend. What do I mean by that? He can count the triangles as separate items, but he can also see them as a unit together and count that unit as 6 units of those triangles. He also can see the triangles as individual shapes, but simultaneously see them as composing a larger shape, the square. When you can go back and forth between those two, you are primed when these 4-year-olds get to, say, 2nd grade, to understand place value, because when you do multi-digit addition subtraction, you have to understand that 10 ones can be 1 10 or 10 ones, and you have to be able to switch back and forth between those two views. These kids are building a foundation for that kind of thinking as young as 3 and 4 years of age.
Wow. And so it totally goes beyond just counting to 10 or counting to 20, counting to 100. It's really trying to get a conceptual and cognitive development here happening that serves as a foundation. Now, often in early childhood, a lot of attention focuses on literacy and language, right, and the importance of that. What is the importance of these early mathematic foundations happening in early childhood?
That's a great question. One thing to think about is mathematics is itself a language, a special language, and so just like other languages, this is really important for kids to build up the language of mathematics. But it's very important. Math is increasingly important. As it shows on this slide, almost 4/5 of adults cannot compute interest paid on a loan. Almost 3/4 of adults can't calculate miles per gallon when they take a trip. And more than half of adults in our society can't compute a 10% tip on a bill. Not a very high tip, so but it should be mathematically easier, and we don't. So our culture isn't really a very numerate culture right now, and we've got to address that. We got to start with the youngest kids. More important, though, for child development is how important early math is for kids. What kids know when they enter kindergarten predicts how well they'll do in mathematics as far out as high school. What kids know in mathematics is the best predictor that people have found. Social, emotional, literacy, language, those kind of predictors. Math is a better predictor for entrance into college. So it's incredibly, surprisingly important to get kids thinking mathematically at an early age. I love math, but I would have never predicted that it's more predictive. Let me tell you another study real quickly. Early literacy, entering kindergarten, knowledge literacy, predicts later reading scores. Okay, unsurprising. Early math predicts later math scores. Again, unsurprising. Early mathematics predicts later reading scores better than early literacy scores do. It's shocking, but the reason is, I think because mathematics is so far beyond just little bits of facts and counting. It's cognitively fundamental. It's logical mathematical thinking that is probably accounting for those kind of predictive success. Early mathematics also in these kind of international comparisons. We know we don't perform quite so well internationally, right? But if we do a better job early in life, that will really help us. As you can see in this particular visual here, early mathematics activities before kids start school, if they have a lot of those kind of activities, they score far higher in mathematics years and years later than do kids who have fewer of those activities. Likewise, students who are in preschool perform better in later mathematics. And finally, students who engage in these kind of tasking and have these kind of competencies when they start kindergarten, as a result of those experiences, perform better later in mathematics. So these kind of international comparisons and research are quite clear. Early mathematics is more important than we've given it credit for in the past.
And probably giving attention to it in the present, which is why we're here.
That's right.
one of the things is we do know about a lot of inequalities later in adulthood or even in school, 8th grade, 3rd grade testing scores, high school graduations. Do inequalities show up early, even in early childhood mathematics when kids first come to preschool, for example?
That's another surprising thing, Ebony, is that as young as 3 years of age, both the international comparisons show and within society comparisons show these differences. In other words, children from the United States as early as 3 years of age perform lower than kids from China, for example, in one study. Entering at 3 years of age don't have those informal experiences. But a greater gap is between kids within China or within the US who come from lower resource or higher resource communities. Children from lower resource communities perform far lower than the kids from higher resource communities as early as 3 and 4 years of age.
What does that look like?
They just don't have the experience.
What does that look like? How do you actually see the gaps between the children in there?
In this particular study, they just sit kids down and ask them math questions. Very simple kind of things from counting to early addition and subtraction, which sounds like, why would you do that with 3 and 4-year-olds? But kids can do that. Kids from higher resource communities, you tell them you have 3 candies, and then you have 2 more candies. They'll count out 3, and they'll count out 2, and then they'll 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they'll count it out. Kids from lower resource communities don't have those kind of schemes or ways of thinking about these situations that the kids from higher resource communities do. And you think, okay, so is there a difference between those communities? No, the difference is really resources. The families, the communities don't have the kind of physical, material, and cognitive resources in their environment. When preschools can do some high-quality mathematics, you see those gaps just disappear. Those kids come right up to speed. They have no trouble learning mathematics whatsoever. They just haven't had the opportunities to engage in that kind of thinking.
Do you have examples from for a couple of kids or how that actually shows up in there?
One study's quite interesting in that regard. They just did interviews of kids to see what they knew upon entering kindergarten, right? Peter knew how to count past 120. They had to stop him because they ran out of time. He would have kept going. He could solve these early addition and subtraction with very small numbers, right? He knew the number after and before other numbers all the way up to 100, actually. He could tell you 78 comes after 77, for instance. Tom, on the other hand, couldn't count to 10. When asked the arithmetic problems, he didn't know how to solve them. And when asked what number came after 6, he said horse. When asked, well, what number comes after 1, he said bike. He didn't lack intelligence. He didn't lack the ability to learn. He lacked the experience he needed to be able to learn. Both those kids were entering kindergarten. They are not on a level playing field at that point. One of them is headed to college entrance and one of them is not. And the more we can do in early childhood to close that gap, the more we can do to make sure they get an equitable chance to get to college and have good lives and good careers.
Absolutely. Well, let's switch and let's talk about what we can actually do in early childhood classrooms and what does early childhood math look like in preschool or young child classrooms?
That's a great question because, as I'm sure all of us will share different stories, what we don't mean is kids doing first grade. Well, actually, I wish they wouldn't do first grade math like that, sitting in rows and doing worksheets. But we certainly don't mean that kind of teaching strategy pushed down into early childhood. We mean a much more active teaching and learning kind of thing, but still engaging in mathematical ideas. So let's take a look at a video. I'm going to introduce it a little bit. What's going to happen here is the teacher's trying to teach a little bit of geometry. But what I'd like you to note about the video is that kids are not at desks, they're not sitting down, they're not doing worksheets. They're indeed crawling and moving all over the floor, they're using their whole bodies, and more, they're not just learning the names of shapes, they're learning about justifying their decisions based on the attributes of those shapes. Wow, that sounds like middle school stuff, not done appropriately. So let's take a look at the video and see what the teacher is doing, a modified version of something like musical chairs, where she's going to call out a shape name, and then kids have to find that shape and get in it.
Okay, great.
Square. Okay. Is everybody in a square? Are you sure? Drew, are you in a square? How do you know? Four what? Four sides. Are all the sides the same length, Drew? They are. And what are the corners like? Are they square corners? They are. All of you are in squares. Very nice. Joshua, find a rectangle, please. In or out? Okay. Once you found your shape, stay in it, okay? Savannah, where are you going, sweetheart? Rectangle. Find one. Alrighty, is everybody in a rectangle right now? Yes. Are you in a rectangle? You are? How do you know? It is a special one. How do you know it's a rectangle though, first of all?
That's because it has 4 sides.
It has 4 sides. And what are the corners like? What kind of corners? Square corners, and this one just happens to have all of its sides be the same, right? So what do we call this special rectangle? A square. Oh, you're so smart. All right, one more time. Medium level, fast speed, ready, go. Watch where you're going.
So you could see there how active the kids are and how much they're thinking. You can also see this brilliant teacher, Lucinda, added on to our activity that she has them either be at a low level, medium level, or high level and crawl fast or move medium speed or move quickly. That's her idea. I love it. So she gets so many concepts in. But do you see she's asking the kids, and kids can justify what they're saying on the basis of the properties of these geometric shapes. These are 4-year-olds justifying things that often adults don't understand too well because of our lack of good geometry education. As just one example, did you notice that when the kids got in a square, when she asked them to get in a rectangle, she didn't tell them, no, 2 long sides or 2 short sides, which is, by the way, the worst possible explanation of what a rectangle is. But she said, yes, so can you justify why it is? Because it has all right angles. It's a certain type of rectangle. What would we call this special rectangle? A square, she says. So now these erroneous concepts we sometimes teach, that a square is not a rectangle, that kids have to unlearn in middle and high school, because a square is a special type of rectangle, they're brought up naturally by the teacher and understood by the kids in obviously motivated, excited kind of environment that they're in right now.
That's exciting. Well, I would love to take this conversation from what we just saw in the videos from the kids and to the teachers to back up to what we're doing here in the state of Indiana. So I want to introduce our next panelist. Dana Jones is an early learning specialist at the Indiana State Department of Education. She's working with community early childhood programs and developmental preschools. She serves on the Legislative Committee on Child Care and is working on various projects with several agencies throughout the state of Indiana. Ms. Jones holds a degree in child development and business administration and is currently working on her master's degree in adult education with a specialization in early childhood. She has been in the field of early childhood education for over 20 years, having worked with licensed child care, a registry ministry, and has mentored family child care providers. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So tell us about, from the state's perspective, from the state of Indiana, how are they responding to the needs for early childhood mathematics in early childhood?
Well, having early learning guidelines is a very important part. We know that academic standards are designed to promote excellence in education, and our early learning guidelines, which we call the foundations to the Indiana academic standards, we shorten it by calling them the foundations, were created to be an example of what mathematics can look like in early learning programs, regardless of the setting. And so we do have other subjects within the foundations, but mathematics, of course, is one of the main chapters that we do have in there. They are based for programs that work with children from birth to age 5, because we do know from research that mathematical learning happens from very early on in a child's life. And they are done based on research, which is always should be a foundation for what we're doing with young children, because people have spent years studying what best practice is, and we want to encourage that to happen. The foundations look like not a checklist. They do not look like a checklist for what children should learn before they get to kindergarten, but it's really a framework of what early learning providers, again, in whatever setting, can help the children experience before they get to kindergarten in order to build those mathematical skills for each child, finding them wherever they are, and then building upon their knowledge base. We want to help them to gain that knowledge and the skills in their early learning, because we know of the disparity that can happen once they get to school. So we want to address that. The framework is a guide for the providers. So as they have assessed a child and found out where their learning gaps may be, they can find activities within the foundations that they can help build that child's skills and plan activities in the classroom, or even families can do that in their home. If they realize that their child needs some help, they can identify something in the foundations that will help that child learn a new concept and build those skills. So it is a wide range. We consider it a framework. It's not a curriculum. It's not something that, if I do all these activities, that's going to be a fun day, because it's a lot of information. But it is a framework, and that the curriculum that early learning programs use can be matched up to the foundations, and that's what many programs do. And they are able to really build that love of learning within a child's early childhood experiences, which really increases their love of learning throughout their education. And mathematics, if you don't get that love of mathematics young, it is very difficult to come about later in life, I will attest to personally. And it's also, we want to build that sense of having that positive attitude about mathematics. We know that there's mathematics in every activity that we can do with children, whether it is music or whether it's art. We can build that. You saw the active mathematical learning that was happening in the video that Doug showed, and so that's what it needs to be like, and that's how children will remember those skills the most. We have we did a revision of the foundations last year. We finished that workup, and we have referenced all of the Indiana academic standards for the subject areas. And currently in kindergarten, we have referenced the Common Core English Language Arts and Mathematics standard that would look at that section of mathematical learning. And then we have the Fine Arts and the Social Studies academic standards referenced also, because we want the early learning providers to see this is what we're working towards at the kindergarten level. And so that's something that we're able to implement. The revision was necessary because of some updates to academic standards in the state of Indiana through the years, and we hadn't done a revision in a while. And we also did a standardization of our early childhood assessment. And so we wanted to make sure that all lined up, which is a really great thing, and that we have a tool for early learning providers to know what to do with young children for mathematics and other subjects.
I want to talk about more later about the assessments and what you do with providers, but how does the framework actually translate, or what does it look like in practice? Like, what does it mean for teachers and programs in early childhood settings?
Well, we have many programs in the state of Indiana that are accredited. Many of them participate in our Paths to Quality program, and those programs follow national standards for the activities that they're providing and the content that they're providing, because we know nationally what is good for young children. And so in those settings, you would see children doing mathematical learning throughout their day, whether it is in child-directed activities or it's teacher-directed. The teachers do a great job of finding out what the needs are of the children and then intentionally planning those activities for the children. And so we would see them do lots of different activities with the children, active learning, and having those appropriate experiences. And there are many suggestions within the foundations of what they can do, and that's where they can really build that if they, we're not setting them out on their own to do that on their own.
Cool. Well, I think this is perfect for me to bring in Dr. Ted Maple to the conversation, who can give some additional examples of what looks like mathematics. Dr. Ted Maple is president and CEO of the Day Nursery Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit child care provider in Indiana. Day Nursery operates 7 nationally accredited early childhood centers in central Indiana, as well as local child care resource and referral program. Prior to joining the Day Nursery, Ted worked as a teacher and preschool director and led the United Way of Central Indiana's education initiatives. He holds 2 degrees in elementary education, a BS from the University of Indianapolis and an MS from Butler University. Ted has also got a PhD in early childhood education from Ball State University. He is past president of the Indiana Association of the Education of Young Children. So welcome, thank you for being here. So tell us, how does mathematics look like in the programs that you worked with and that you've served in the classrooms and on teachers? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Well, great mathematics instruction in early childhood programs and high quality early childhood programs looks like any kind of great instruction in early childhood programs where a teacher begins with planned systematic instruction, and that takes place in setting up a great learning environment that's stimulating, that's well equipped for children at their age level, at their developmental level, as well as planning activities like some of the activities you see in the visuals on the screen that are individual activities, small group activities, or whole group activities. That gives teachers the opportunity to teach patterning, counting, one-to-one correspondence, geometric concepts. But also, I think what really takes mathematic instruction to the next level is when a really great teacher can find teachable moments in authentic ways through play, when the children are in play, or even through inquiry-based projects that are based on children's questions, children's interests, and their investigations. For example, at Day Nursery, recently teachers worked to put together a pumpkin patch project that children planned, which involved, of course, a lot of fun digging in the dirt, planting seeds, and everything that goes along with gardening. But they also talked about predicting the number of plants that would grow from those seeds, measuring how high those plants would grow. So the teacher very skillfully brought in math concepts that teacher had taught previously in a more systematic way. Also, at Day Nursery, they put up together a lemonade stand project in which kids had the opportunity to work with numbers and currency in a very authentic way. My favorite project when I taught kindergarten a long time ago was a post office project back when post offices were more active. And this was planned by me, but the kids were very engaged in how this post office would be operated. So they determined the hours of the post office in which the other kids in the school would come and purchase their postage stamps, how much the postage stamps would cost. And then what was most interesting was how to sort the mail based on zones around the school, and they color-coded the mail. This was a real opportunity for them to apply the mathematical concepts in a much more real and authentic way. And I believe that kids get the most out of that type of opportunity.
Wonderful. Why don't you take a second just to have a question from the audience? And this is going to go to Dana. Are there any additional resources for early childhood education from the state, from the Indiana Department of Education?
Sure. We have, we're very proud of our Indiana birth to age 5 literacy framework. As Doug mentioned earlier, we talk a lot about literacy. And so again, we created a framework of best practice for literacy instruction for children from birth to age 5. So that's one of our other key things that we like to promote throughout the state.
Wonderful, great. And one more question from the audience, and this is for both Doug and Ted, just based on your recent comments about what it looks like in the classroom, mathematics, and some examples that you gave there. Well, the question is, are you saying that classrooms should be, in the mathematics instruction, be structured around play? And what is the role of direct instruction then for mathematics?
That's a really good question. Ted, you first?
Well, I think we need a balance of systematic instruction and as I mentioned, the opportunity that the teacher might take to bring a more teachable or authentic moment when kids are building with blocks or with or in the Arts Center. There might be opportunities to bring in math concepts. The real key is for that teacher to understand how to interact with that child in order to bring out discussions and concepts and how to use open-ended questions that you saw Doug refer to in the videos.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ted, absolutely. And I think what happens to us so much in early childhood is we fall into having these, what I call false dichotomies. You know, either you're play-based or you're direct instruction. Either you care about the child first, or you just care about getting skills down. I think they're false for a couple reasons. First of all, when we talk about instruction, intentional instruction, I like the words intentional or explicit instruction so much better than direct instruction, only because direct instruction often has when it goes back to its roots, brighter and the like, it has this idea that we're just telling. The teacher's telling kids are passively absorbing. We don't mean that. Explicit instruction is very helpful, especially from kids from low resource communities, where you're explicating the ideas. You want the child to be talking more than the teacher talking, but you are very intentional about leading the kid through a curriculum, a sequence of ideas that progress from one to the other. Most kids learn verbal counting, and then one-to-one correspondence, and then cardinality, and then in order. So if you know that order, if you understand the learning trajectory and can assess the child at that, then you can do some intentional teaching with that child. That's also important, especially for kids who are English language learners, especially for children of color, especially for kids from low resource communities. So, and then an interesting study by Dale Farron and Mark Lipsey, in which they looked at preschools and the quality of play, not the quality of instruction only, but the quality of play. They found that the more that those preschools who had intentional math instruction in whole and small groups, short but focused attention, had a higher quality of sociodramatic play during the time when kids were in free play or child-centered kind of activities. So rather than see it, I agree with direct instruction or I agree with play-based instruction, it's a false dichotomy. If you do a little bit of explicit, intentional instruction, you get higher levels of sociodramatic play. Just that kind of play that leads to self-regulation skills among language literacy and those kind of things. So rather than seeing it either or, we should see it as both and. A good balanced, which is I think the word Ted was using, a good balanced combination of those. Not a little bit from each one, but an intentional integration of those kind of teaching strategies turns out to be more effective.
And in addition to that kind of integration of those teaching strategies, are there other things that we could be doing, and by we I mean the teachers, the providers, even parents in the classroom to assure children's development in mathematical thinking?
Yeah, certainly. For one, I think understanding what kids need to be learning in a sequential way. I think what I'd like to add to what Doug said is what we see too often is teachers or parents relying on worksheets or workbooks to provide that sequential instruction and calling it academic, and parents choosing what they believe to be an academic program, whereas it's really not fitting the bill. And though it's a harder and more challenging task, the adults should be taking what they know the young children need, as Doug said, in a sequential way, and applying what kids need in a developmentally appropriate manner, whether it be through structured play activities, through learning centers, through experiences like very directed and systematic projects, group activities. I think that's where we really need to pay attention. We have too many kids either in programs where it's too workbook or too passively based, or too many kids in programs where it's completely unstructured and there's really no attention to what kids need to learn and do.
Well, a key thing I heard in your response there is understanding what kids need and starting off with where kids are. And so maybe, Dana, can you talk a little bit about where the state is in terms of assessing young children, the very beginning of them entering into the system, to see where they are and what needs they might have?
Sure. The Indiana Department of Education has an early childhood assessment called iStar-KR. The acronym is the Indiana Standards Tool for Assessment Reporting Kindergarten Readiness. And so this assessment is valid for children that are infant through kindergarten entry. And it looks at 30 different learning strands, mathematics, of course, being several of those 30 strands, and to see where children are in their learning. And it is a standardized test, good for all children, and the teachers then can use that data to share with families, and also they would have information on what the child would be learning next in their development. And so it is a very informative assessment that's available and free for our programs to utilize.
Dana, some people, when you hear standardized tests, they think, okay, kids are sitting down in front of and that's not what you mean. Can you give us an example of an assessment test?
Sure. This assessment is based solely on what the teacher observes the child being able to do. And so that intentional instruction, that way the teacher can realize whether that child has that skill or not. It's a computer-based, so the children are not on there at all. It's the teacher just doing some data entry to kind of program in where the child is, where they've mastered those skills, and then they can work from there on in planning through their curriculum. And so it's total teacher observation and actually evidence of their learning through their projects or pictures or drawings or photographs can also be added for that.
Nice.
Thanks for asking.
That's good. So the one thing is assessing where the children are, and the other is then preparing teachers, so be able to provide and respond to the needs of kids. So what kind of professional development resources are there and experiences that maybe both of you have had in supporting teachers? Because a lot of teachers may not think about all the creative ways that we've talked about mathematics in the early childhood classrooms.
Right. Well, I am fortunate to be able to offer a lot of professional development to providers. I often utilize our statewide child care resource and referral system that we have, and use them as the starting point for that. I would work individually with programs if they requested it, and then we also again have the foundations that many providers utilize, and they do get professional development on the use of that tool also, which is quite helpful. It's not just a large document to stare at on the shelf.
That's good. That's good. Ted, do you have examples from your programs?
Sure. One of the things that I really like about Path to Quality, our state rating system, it's a 4-level system, 4 being the highest, is that with each level, the program is required to have a higher and higher level of teacher education and professional development. So we have teachers at day nursery, for example, that are earning their Child Development Associate's credential, their associate's degree and bachelor's degrees in early childhood in order for us to attain national accreditation and that level 4 status. Part of that, of course, is mathematics instruction. So the more credential and degree teachers we have serving children, the more we can be assured that they're going to get great instruction. The second thing is we also have a lot of ongoing professional development provided in the state, whether it be through Indiana Association for the Education of Young Children, the Department of Education, Child Care Answers, where we can offer workshops for teachers that can help them learn how to do just the type of things we're talking about.
Doug, do you have some thoughts about the professional development we can give for teachers as well in the classroom and what that looks like?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and just want to say that we found that the most important thing is for people to really understand children's development of mathematics. We've done studies in which we compared curricula that were based on these learning trajectories to curricula that are, have just as many activities, just as many things, but a curriculum based on learning trajectories. The children learned 2 times as much as the other curricula because not just the effectiveness of the activities, but the effectiveness that teachers know the kids. They know the kids' development. They know mathematics, the child's way of learning and thinking about mathematics, and they use that. So learning trajectories, in our view, have 3 basic parts, right? There's a goal, a developmental progression, and instructional activities. So the goal, let us say, is counting objects meaningfully. The developmental progression means kids go through certain standard levels of thinking on their way to achieving that goal that most children follow. So if you understand that, you can look at kids and really understand where they are. We always say, start where the child is. Everybody agrees with that. But if you don't know what the levels of thinking are, where they start and where it goes, starting where the child is almost meaningless, right? It's just it becomes an empty phrase rather than a meaningful teaching technique. So there's a goal, a developmental progression of levels of thinking through which kids pass on their way to achieving that goal, and then instructional activities that are tied to each one of those levels of thinking. So to illustrate that in counting a little bit, I would like you to look at 2 videos, and I'm going to introduce them first for a second. Both videos have girls counting in a very simple task. These are just 3.5 to 4-year-old kids in the videos. They're both asked to just count a row of objects. Each of them is pretty competent, but there's a difference between the 2. And part of our professional development work is what we do is we show videos, the teachers' videos of kids, and talk about what's different here? What is different in the kids' thinking as a way of developing that knowledge of what we look at, what we can see when we look at kids doing different tasks. So I'd like everybody to look at the 2 videos. We'll show one at a time and think about, what does this kid know? What is the skills this kid have? And then when they see the second video, what's different about the skills and knowledge of that child from the first child? So let's take a look at the first video.
Would you count these for me? How many chips are there all together? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you.
So I think we've all seen that behavior before. Well, first of all, let's stress absolute positive. She knew her number words. She knew them in order. She kept them separate. She could do one-to-one correspondence. But I think all of us in education have seen that kind of thing, that when you ask how many, she recounted. So think about what you would have to do to have a conception that's, for that child, to have a conception closer to this next child who's doing a very similar counting task. Let's take a look.
Could you count those bananas and tell me how many there are?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, that was cut off a little bit at the end. So after she counts, she asks the child, how many? And instead of recounting, the child immediately just says 5. So that child has achieved the next level of thinking, what mathematicians call cardinality, which is merely a word that means how manyness. The second child understands that the last counting word is special in that it tells the number of the whole set. When you're counting, in the act of counting, all you care about is order, keeping your objects in order, keeping your number words in order. When you're done counting, order doesn't matter. The how manyness of all the objects in that set is what matters. We help teachers see those kind of levels of thinking, so whether they're doing projects or in small groups playing games or whatever, they can recognize where the different children are and provide activities for them and to provide interactions with the kids that'll help them achieve the next level of thinking.
I think this is a great place for us to take another audience questions, which takes not only what we do to provide professional development to teachers, but is there anything we can do even in higher education? And the question is, besides professional development, what can institutes of higher education to do to better train teachers during a pre-service training for early childhood mathematics? Any thoughts on that?
You're our higher ed person.
Okay. Well, we don't do very well. Okay, first of all, too many states, and you can speak to that better than me for here, this state. Too many states require far more work in literacy and language than they do in mathematics. It is not a battle, it's both and. We need both, we need literacy, we need language, we need good mathematics education. But in many states, there's no requirement for any particular math course or math methods course or anything. Teachers need the content knowledge. They need to understand the mathematics. And given the admittedly poor state of mathematics education in our country for quite a few decades, many teachers can graduate college and still really not have a firm grasp on the fundamental ideas that are in the mathematics, even for the youngest child. And then we need courses that do things like we've been talking about, all of us have been talking about already, that really take the mathematics and say, how do kids learn this mathematics? How do you do mathematics children's way? How do they think about it? How can we develop that in a way that's developmentally appropriate for kids, engaging for kids, motivating for kids, isn't imposed on kids, but brings the natural mathematical thinking of kids out to an explicit level of awareness?
What I also, and this is also an audience question, is not only then how do we do that for teachers, but how can we do that for parents and families? So what can parents, sisters, families do to support young children's mathematics in their everyday life? Tad, did you have some?
Well, I think for families, the best way to do that is as Doug said earlier, is to make the world mathematical for kids, is to bring that out, and to do that in those everyday moments that parents are with young children, whether in the grocery store or at home or or walking down the street or at dinner, talking about mathematical concept in those settings. That's a much more natural and easy way to do it. We were talking earlier about board games, and I think Doug mentioned that there's been some research done about that.
Yeah, board games are really important. We don't see children playing them as much anymore. Bob Siegler from Carnegie Mellon did a series of research studies on here with some of his colleagues and found out that, number one, homes in which board games and card games are played, the kids are more highly competent in mathematics. That's all there is to it. He also found if you can get the parents to pull out the old Parcheesi's, I think that you said that was your favorite, Candyland, what have other Chutes and Ladders and the rest that we were saying, and engaging in those. You just think about what happens when you play a board game, to just think how important it is. It's not just that there's more math and more talk about math. That's great. But just think about that. You're playing a board game. You roll a die. You see a number of dots on that die. You have to move that many spaces. So now you're connecting different representations of number. One is this number of dots, right? One is how long it takes you to move, how far you move, how many actions you have to take to move that many. These different representations are all connected together for kids informally and in a most enjoyable way as they play board games. So just encouraging people to play board games, play card games with their kids, and doing it in school too is really important to kids' early mathematics development.
Well, we're in a computer state society though, and so we only have a few seconds left before we have to end our programming. So in a few seconds, how do we take that to this kind of computer-based system in the world we live in?
Ted was saying before, a lot of these board games, or maybe it was you, that saying a lot of the board games are on computer, and that's not bad. I prefer, in some instances, I'm a big advocate of high quality computer games, and they're out there. but you have to search for them, and you have to see that kids are doing mathematical thinking. The thinking wasn't done by the programmer for the kid is engaged in mathematical thinking. But that's a limited time of day. The rest of the time, get them on the floor with these cards and board games.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I want to thank my panelists so much for being here talking about this. This is exciting, and we definitely do need to pay a lot more attention to early childhood mathematics. And I'm glad you three are doing your part in that. And for the REL Midwest, thank you for participating. And I will now thank all of our audience members who were here in our live watching this taping. And now I'll take this back over to Dean.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's program on research-based strategies that can be implemented in schools, homes, and communities to improve mathematics skills in young children. REL Midwest has launched several research alliances made up of stakeholders from state agencies, school districts, and other education organizations in the region. Through the alliances, we are providing analytic and research expertise to assist education leaders in their improvement efforts and data-informed decision-making. The REL Midwest Early Childhood Education Research Alliance focuses on understanding and improving the quality of early childhood education programs. You can learn more about REL Midwest and the REL program by visiting our website or following us on Twitter. An archive of this event, including resources mentioned by the panelists, is available on our website. Thank you again for joining us.